What if your freedom wasn't taken away by a dictator, not by tanks in the streets, not by a new law passed overnight, but by numbers, invisible numbers? Numbers so abstract most people never question them. Numbers that don't vote, don't protest, don't carry weapons, yet quietly decide how long you'll work, what you can afford, and how much of your future is already spent. Here's the mystery. Across the world, no global law has been passed that says people must work longer, retire later, pay more taxes, or accept shrinking public services. And yet, all of that is happening. No vote, no announcement, no revolution. So how did it happen? Tonight, we re-uncovering how global debt rewrites freedom without a single law, and why once this process starts, it's almost impossible to stop. Setting the stage, background, and teasing twists, debt didn't begin as a weapon. In its earliest form, debt was simple and personal. A farmer borrowed seed. A merchant borrowed silver. A king borrowed to fight a war. The idea was temporary imbalance, a bridge between now and later. But somewhere along the way, debt stopped being a tool, and became a system. A system with institutions instead of individuals. Contracts instead of handshakes. An interest that never sleeps. By the 20th century, debt was no longer just something people carried. Nations carried it. Entire populations were born into obligations they never agreed to. Governments promised that debt meant growth. Banks promised stability. Economists promised control. But buried inside those promises was a quiet twist. Debt doesn't need force to control behavior. It only needs time. And time is exactly what debt consumes. Part 1. Origins. When debt learned to outlive people, the story begins with war. Large-scale debt exploded during major wars because governments needed resources faster than taxes could provide. Instead of raising taxes, which caused revolts, rulers borrowed. It's introduced a dangerous idea. Borrow now, let the future pay. At first it seemed harmless. Wars ended. Economies grew. Debts shrank relative to expansion. But then something changed. Central banking systems emerged. Bonds became tradable. Interests became predictable. Debt stopped being a temporary emergency measure and became a permanent fixture. The key shift wasn't economic. It was psychological. Once governments realized they could borrow indefinitely, as long as confidence remained, restraint disappeared. Debt no longer needed repayment. It only needed refinancing. That was the moment debt learned to outlive generations. Part 2. Rise. How debt became invisible control as debt grew. Something fascinating happened. No one felt it directly. There were no debt collectors knocking on citizens' doors. No warnings on ballots. No line items saying your freedom has been reduced by 3% this year. Instead, debt influenced decisions quietly. Governments prioritized bond markets over voters. Policies were shaped to maintain confidence. Social programs became negotiable, but debt payments were sacred. Debt payments came first. Everything else came second. This is where freedom began to change shape. Freedom wasn't removed, it was redefined. We were still free to speak, but austerity limited public platforms. Free to work, but wages stagnated under fiscal discipline. Free to vote, but all major parties promised to honor the same debts. Debt didn't need laws to restrict choice, it simply made alternatives impossible. Part 3. Breaking point. When debt reaches the human limit, every debt system eventually hits a wall, not a financial wall, a human one. As global debt climbed into the tens of trillions, servicing it required constant extraction. Higher taxes, lower real wages, reduced public services, delayed retirements. People were told this was necessary, temporary, responsible, but the relief never came. Instead, debt demanded more. This is the breaking point. When people realize they're working not to build a future, but to maintain the past. A past built on promises already spent. At this stage, governments face a dilemma. Raise taxes and risk unrest. Cut services and risk instability. Default and risk collapse. So they choose the fourth option. Part 4. Fallout. The quiet rewrite of freedom. The fourth option is monetization. Instead of confronting debt, governments print money to manage it. On paper, nothing changes. In reality, everything does. Inflation becomes a silent tax. Savings lose value. Assets concentrate upward. Your people work harder, but feel poorer. They blame corporations, politicians, immigrants, each other. Rarely do they blame debt because debt is abstract. Here's the hidden fallout. Debt forces governments to govern for creditors, not citizens. Policies must reassure markets first. Budgets must please bondholders before voters. Stability becomes more important than justice. Freedom isn't taken, it's priced. Part 5. Failed fixes: why solutions never solve the core problem. Every generation proposes solutions. Growth will outpace debt. Technology will save productivity. Austerity will restore balance. Printing money is harmless. Each solution treats debt as a math problem. But debt isn't mathematical, it's behavioral. The system requires expansion forever in a finite world. It assumes future productivity will always cover past promises. When growth slows, debt tightens control. That's why fixes fail. They never ask the forbidden question: should all debt be honored at any cost? Because the moment you ask that, the entire system trembles. Modern parallels patterns repeating right now. Look around. Record global debt, rising living costs, younger generations owning less, governments constrained despite historic spending. This isn't coincidence. Debt follows a repeating pattern. Borrow for stability. Normalize borrowing, depend on borrowing, restructure society around repayment. We're in stage 4. The most shocking part: no new laws required. Debt rewrites freedom by narrowing options until compliance feels like choice. 3 clear takeaways. Takeaway 1. Debt doesn't need force to control behavior. It uses obligation and time. Takeaway 2. When debt becomes permanent, democracy becomes conditional. Takeaway 3. The real cost of debt isn't money. It's flexibility, dignity, and future choice. Final warning, an open-ended thought: every system that relies on infinite promises eventually asks one question: who pays? If the answer is always the future, then one day the future answers back. Not with laws, not with votes, but with consequences. The question isn't whether debt will change freedom. It already has. The question is whether people will notice before the choices disappear entirely. Call to action: if this made you see the world differently, share it with someone who still thinks debt is just numbers. Subscribe for deep dives that connect history, money, and power, without slogans, without noise. And leave a comment. Do you think debt is a tool, or the most powerful form of control ever created? Because the real discussion starts there.